to introduce our new this year wildlife specialist, Dr. Jared Beaver. I guess he's already been here for quite a while now. This year's flown by. Giving us a little update on feral swine. So I will mute myself and turn it over to you, Jared.
Great, thanks. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk. This is what I consider a pretty important topic, and one that Montana has really come together on, the various agencies, with a kind of consistent messaging, which is really important. So I'm gonna go ahead and, am I good to share right now?
It should be, yep.
Good on your end?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so, the talk today is, on feral swine, wild pigs, whichever terminology you'd like to use, and why Montana should care. And that's something that is a little less common as I've gotten into my position here. And so it's a topic I like to shed some light on, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time today doing that. And so I always like to follow a roadmap. And so the wild pig situation and why Montana should care will follow kind of a history and biology. So basically a brief high-level overview, the damage and threats that they pose, so what the problem is, numbers, distribution, growth, the current status, and then lastly, why Montana is taking a no hunting stance and what those kind of regulations and management responses are from Montana's side of things. And so, a good place to start is, what is a wild pig? They go by a lot of names: feral swine, wild pig, feral hog, wild boar, razorbacks, you name it, a pig's been called it. Basically, there's one species of pig, and it's Sus scrofa. And it was the Eurasian wild boar that was then domesticated into domestic swine. And now you get domestic swine that has escaped and in a few generations become feral swine. And then you also get the hybridization from both feral hogs and Eurasian wild boar. And so really the term feral swine, or more commonly what I use is wild pigs, includes all varieties of domestic hogs that have escaped into the wild and been released, whether purposefully or not, as well as any form of hybrid or naturally occurring Eurasian wild boar. The hybrid aspect kind of is what is going to be most common, and that's kind of that perfect disaster, that perfect storm, the super pig. You get the reproductive genetics of a domestic pig that's bred to breed all year, have tremendous litters, heavy weight, and then you get the wild boar attributes that help survive harsh conditions and aggressively compete with other wildlife. And so moving forward, the terminology wild pig, feral swine, it basically encompasses any variation of those. And so one thing I do like to point out is the worldwide distribution of pigs, and you'll see in black, that's the naturally occurring environment where pigs were native. And then you'll see in gray, pretty much all over the rest of the world, there are current pig populations, and in fact, they would be exotic and invasive in these cases. And so to the New World, particularly the North Americas, feral swine are not native. So they are, in fact, an invasive species to our country. And so, how did they get here? And really, swine have been introduced to North America since exploration and colonization. And they were brought primarily for food. They were fast breeders, fairly easy to maintain and keep around. And obviously, as these people left, the pigs would get out or would have been released. And ever since kind of colonization, Pigs have continued to be introduced, and from this standpoint, it's primarily been for sport hunting, which I'll get into a little bit later. And then again, they're not native, and they're a highly effective invasive species. They're habitat generalists, so they can live pretty much anywhere. They can eat pretty much anything. They take significant advantage of opportunities that are given to them. They're actually highly intelligent, have a high fecundity, and super adaptable. And there's very few natural predators to the pig right now. And so just some basic biology, in simple terms, they'll pretty much eat anything with a calorie in it. The ultimate opportunistic omnivore, if you will, from crops and soft and hard mass, grasses, forbs, roots, bulbs, fungi, and then even to invertebrates and even small mammals, birds, nests, amphibians. So you name it, they'll basically eat it. In fact, one person kind of put it to me that kind of researches pigs is they'll compete with the wildlife for food and beat them to it. And then when that's done, they'll even turn to the wildlife and eat them too. And so they're just a very opportunistic consumer, whether that's of vegetation, which consists about 80 to 90% of their diet is vegetation from the research. But the other 10% will include a variation of, young livestock as well as wildlife species, particularly reptiles and amphibians and nesting songbird and wild turkey nest. And so, the basic biology of a pig, they generally weigh from about 100 to 500 pounds. Anything in that above 4 to 500 is typically rarely exceeded in the wild unless supplemental food or other available highly nutrient-rich food sources are available, such as that meant for livestock. The key here is how prolific they can reproduce. Is a pig can reach sexual maturity within a year, even as young as 6 to 10 months in some of the literature. A gestation is very short, less than 4 months, and their litter size can vary from 4 to 14 piglets. And so you're saying a pig can reproduce 1 to 3 litters a year at 4 to 14 piglets. It's not, that far-fetched to see how they can grow at an exponential rate. And so you have 1,000 pigs, multiplying to 2,000 to 3,000 in a short period of time isn't that much of a deal. But when they get to the size like they are now in the U.S. at 6, 7 million, it doesn't take long to get to 10, 12, 14 million. And that's why kind of this increased global focus on pig management is currently being undertaken in the United States. Their fecundity makes them really difficult to eradicate once established. And most of the states in the Southeast, from a management standpoint, will tell you eradication is no longer possible and it's no longer the goal. Control is the goal. In states such as Montana, and why this has become such an important issue is inevitably when pigs do show up, eradication is still the ultimate objective and possible. But once you get pigs, they're like a ticking time bomb, and that's because of their ability to reproduce prolifically. Sows and young make up what's called sounders. So basically, it's their family social group. The young males actually will disperse from the sounder, though, typically before 2 years of age. Sows and young, again, stay kind of in that family social network, while the adult males tend to be solidarity, only joining when it's time to breed or around concentrated feeding areas and sources. Behavior and movement is pretty interesting, and it's a topic that's being researched pretty intensely right now. But basically, they're super adaptable. They have a tendency to be aggressive. They practice nomadic movements, so they generally spread around fairly constantly. They don't have that general niche that they stay in for their lifetime. And some things people are a little surprised about is that pigs are actually really good swimmers. So crossing rivers, and water sources isn't that difficult for them. And they're actually very fast runners. And so they have the ability when pressured to disperse very fast and very broadly, which is another reason we really don't have a good idea right now of movements in home range, because it varies so much depending on food availability, access to water, which is very important for them, and thermoregulation. And then in regards to reproduction and management strategies, which gets back to that pressure that is applied to the group. And then lastly, they have a strong sense of smell that they rely on strongly in detecting both danger and food. And their sense of smell is actually their strongest aspect, much better than their eyesight and their hearing, which is why they, when disturbed or startled, have a tendency to just bull rush towards the direction that the noise came from, because they can't really see what it is. And so some of the latest research, which I found was pretty interesting when digging into it, is that it's believed that pigs are capable of sensing strong odors up to 5 to 7 miles away, and can detect food sources, odors from food sources as much as 25 feet underground. So their sense of smell is actually pretty tremendous. So just a basic high-level recap of their biology. They're prolific breeders. That's kind of the thing that we'll come back to that is causing such a problem. They have few natural predators. They can eat and will eat pretty much anything. They can readily adapt to most habitats, even some of those we didn't think possible, like in Canada, in the colder, more harsh environments. Once they find favorable habitat, it's often impenetrable, so management becomes very difficult. They're easily turned into nocturnal feeders, another thing that makes detection and management pretty difficult. And then lastly, the intelligence of the pig is kind of underestimated at times, and they're very mobile animals when pressured, and so distribution can be very wide-ranging. So, as we kind of recap their history and biology, and so it kind of gets into the problem. And this is what I like to focus most of my efforts on, is really highlighting the issue that pigs pose. It's, crosses boundaries. It's not just a rural concern. It's very broad reaching in terms of the damage it can do, both from a natural resources standpoint as well as a human health issue concern. So when we get into this, is wild pigs, wild Montana should care. What is the problem? Is the fact that feral swine are the perfect or worst invasive animal species, and it's kind of one and the same. Is it's two sides to the coin. Is they're perfect for invading an area, which also makes them the worst invasive species. Is that they can live anywhere, they can eat pretty much anything. There's very few predators. They breed prolifically. They cause tremendous damage, and then they're difficult to control and eradicate once established. And so, from an invasive species standpoint, when you think about an invasive species, it usually is detrimental to a few aspects or a few species, but has its limitations. The problem with feral swine is that they're pretty much destructive across the board, very broad, and they impact all sectors. There's very little that a feral swine wouldn't impact. From a risk and threat standpoint, I kind of follow the 4 Ds. From a damage standpoint, depredation, disease, and disturbance, you name it, they're pretty successful at all 4. You talk about crops, livestock, humans, private property, public property, infrastructure, native wildlife and vegetation, watersheds, water quality, you name it, they're going to impact it. And so from a natural resource standpoint, the latest research is showing that they are a tremendous threat to overall biodiversity, both from a plant as well as a wildlife standpoint. And that's because, they consume tremendous amounts of herbaceous vegetation, and they're not selective in what that vegetation is. Their diets can consist in over 80% plant material. And I like to call them nature's rototiller. They don't browse the vegetation, they eat it, they dig it, they stomp it, plow it, root it, trample it, rub it, you name it, they're going to damage it. If they're, existing in that ecosystem, there isn't a plant there that's really not at risk. And then on the other side, they directly compete with wildlife for food, water, and space, and they do so more effectively generally. They're opportunistic predators, and so not only are they competing with wildlife for the food, they're preying on the wildlife, particularly the young, but again, reptiles, amphibians, and then the eggs of ground nesting species are kind of all, up for grabs. Is that pigs eat all the stuff that most wildlife do. They just eat it faster and more effectively, and then they go ahead and eat the wildlife too. It's kind of the saying that I follow that was passed on to me. From a crop standpoint, this is generally the most staggering number to me, is that they're estimated at close to damages in total 2 billion. That's actually not as it relates to crops. From a crop standpoint, it's but 2 billion annually, and about half of that is actually direct crop damage. So you're saying close to 100 $1 billion or $1 billion just in total crop damage, and that's total aggregate cost caused by wild pigs. And then they damage every sector of agriculture, and particularly the high value vegetable crops and money market crops typically are the ones that are the most favorite food for pigs. And so the more we learn, the more apparent it is that we don't fully understand the cost inflicted by pigs. This number varies tremendously based on the source you get it from. And the bottom line is I'm not aware of any crop that is not at risk to damages if grown in the vicinity of feral swine. I don't know one that they won't at least damage in some way. And the same will apply for farm infrastructure like fences and gates and irrigation systems. And from a pasture and range lands, even if they're not necessarily consuming the vegetation, just the damage they do, has its indirect consequences as well. From a soil disturbance standpoint, you could get increases in erosion, weakened levees, increased siltation in your ponds. But then they also consume, contaminate, and destroy supplemental feed sources and mineral sources for livestock. So that's a direct competition with your livestock, and it also puts them in close proximity with them from a disease standpoint. And then probably just as much damage as it does to the crop as it does to infrastructure. Your fences, water supply, irrigation ditches, that stuff's not cheap, and pigs can really wreak havoc on the system. Predation on livestock is something that isn't all that well understood, but it's becoming more and more documented. Most of the predation is seen primarily on calves and lambs, but occasionally adult males or adult animals rather have been confirmed, but mostly those that were vulnerable from a standpoint such as giving birth. In Texas, 33% of county extension agents reported livestock predation by feral swine as a significant problem in the county, which was actually kind of shocking when that report came out. Damage and threats, and this is where it really starts to hit home in Montana, is the disease transmission issue to livestock. Wild pigs carry and transmit a laundry list of diseases and parasites that are zoonotic, so they can cross over to other livestock, animals, pets, as well as humans. But from a livestock standpoint, they're known carriers for Brucella suis. Now that isn't an issue as it is with Brucella abortus in Montana. However, cattle can get it, livestock can get Brucella suis, and that then can complicate the verification process. It can cause false positives for bovine brucellosis, and as we know, that has tremendous impacts to an operation. And so it's still unknown in the research if they can physically serve as a reservoir and transmit Brucella abortus if they're exposed. They haven't really been exposed to a situation where they could come in contact with it in the wild and potentially pick it up. And if that's the case, and pigs do ever establish in Montana, it could have really detrimental effects to our cattle industry. And so here, I'm not a disease expert, but USDA APHIS has tremendous handouts as it relates to livestock disease risk, and they have that split up by each type of livestock as well. So that's typically where I kind of default inquiries to more specific details on the various disease transmissions to livestock. What people don't realize is, especially in areas with tremendous pig populations across the Southeast now, is that they're starting to see kind of that urban establishment, and that leads to urban property damage. It's kind of like your urban deer herds, is that, they'll come in and settle and adapt to those situations and wreak havoc on lawns and gardens. And particularly you see it around urban parks, golf courses, and kind of urban greenways, so to speak, which is where you would see it in Montana. Pigs were to get established. Is we do a really good job with kind of our public recreational aspects around some of our urban centers, and these would probably get hit the hardest. You're looking at destroyed vegetation, wallows, reduced aesthetic values, as well as just a risk from exposure, that human wildlife transmission risk. The other aspect that affects people directly is vehicle damage. We know the damage that deer do on an annual basis as it relates to vehicle collisions, but feral swine are also growing in that. Wild pig vehicle collisions are estimated at about 36 million a year. And each year, there's now starting to be reported a handful of human fatalities as it relates to that. Most people at least know the type of damage a deer can do to a vehicle. Now imagine hitting a group of pigs or hitting a 300, 400, 500-pound pig. So that is a real and potential significant threat. Water quality, and this starts to get more into diseases as well, is wild pigs lack sweat glands, and therefore they have to modify their behavior in order to keep cool. And this is why water is essential to pigs, because it helps them accomplish thermoregulation. This is why you always hear the term wallowing as it relates to pigs, because that's them cooling off. And so water is an essential part of their requirements for existing. And so this directly impacts water quality, given the fact that wild pigs carry a tremendous amount of parasites and diseases, and typically occupy wet areas on a prolonged basis. And so water quality and riparian systems and watersheds will be affected. And this is known to lead to bacterial impairments where wild pigs are present, which plays right into diseases from a human standpoint. As pigs are a reservoir for many infectious diseases in domestic animals, such as classic swine fever. And then E. coli outbreaks are constantly linked to feral swine from an environmental contamination standpoint. And so, again, I'm not a disease expert, so I like to illustrate these graphics, which was given to me by a colleague out of the Noble Research Institute, is that, I'm not, going to go down the list and name all of these, but it basically highlights from a bacterial and a viral standpoint, you're talking about 30, 40 plus diseases that pigs can carry. And then, that it reaches about that same number in terms of just internal parasites. So when you start thinking about risk to livestock or your domestic pets or even to humans, most of these are zoonotic. And so we can get them from pigs. It's that, it's that perfect invasive species, but also a really nasty one in terms of diseases and potential impacts. And so, again, getting into kind of the current status. So it's like, okay, a little bit of the biology and that, we get it. We don't want pigs. They can do a lot of damage. But what is the potential threat, for pigs in Montana, and generally, what is the current situation within the U.S. and Canada? What we're seeing, and these graphics are from USDA, APHIS, and Wildlife Services, is that really it was about the 1980s we started to see this exponential takeoff in the pig population, and that's because it's kind of that growth rate. You have a few, and so it takes a little bit to reproduce, and then it kind of, takes off. And so you have 1,000 pigs, a couple of years you got 2,000 pigs. But if you have 2 million pigs, in a couple of years you got 4 million pigs, and that's what we've seen as that really took off in the 80s. As you can see, from 1982 to 2012, and now this new graphic from 2018, we went from 17 states to 38 states, and overall population has essentially tripled since 1982, and most recent estimates vary anywhere from about 7 to 9 million pigs is what's estimated in the United States. And so really across California, some of the West, and most of the Southeast, they're just holding on. They're raging war now on feral swine, and the efforts is to try and kind of control it because there is no longer, the thought of eradication in most of these places. They're just too integrated into the ecosystem now. And so the distribution in Canada is kind of following that similar path that we saw in the United States. It's just a little bit behind. There isn't a really good estimate on the sheer number of pigs. And really, there's only one primary researcher, Ryan Brook, in Canada, and this is his graphic from a recent publication, is that you kind of started seeing those in the 90s, and that's when there was a big popularity for trying to raise feral swine in Canada, and most of the efforts failed because it was too difficult, and the pigs were released, and now you're seeing this tremendous expansion. Ryan estimates there to be a couple million pigs in Canada, but more importantly, he estimates that about 386,000 square miles across the country will be occupied by pigs in 2020. Most of that is in kind of the Canadian prairie provinces. And he estimates that they're expanding at about 35,000 square miles a year. And so you can see in that 2011, 2017, kind of where the dots are, is it's, awfully close to North Dakota and Montana, and expanding at a rate of, 35,000 square miles a year. It's really only a matter of time. And, there's no way to sugarcoat that pill. Is that they're close to the border, and they're moving and expanding rapidly in Canada. And so what we do know, or rather what we don't know about the distribution in Canada is population size and density. There's just not enough, researchers doing it. Is that, it takes time to get those estimates, and that would take a widespread effort. And the provinces in Canada are handling management a little bit different. So it's really difficult to get a true grasp at total size and density. We're not really sure how far north they're going to move. Not very sure of the disease status there. And again, as the transboundary movements along the U.S.-Canada border, that's a big unknown. We don't know what that likelihood is and whether it's close to happening. And then the urban establishment timeline is how big do they have to get before they start invading these kind of urban settings. What we do know is that there are strongholds on the Canadian prairies where population is expanding out of control in many areas. Sport hunting is widespread and success rates are generally low. And I'll get into that in a few minutes of why, sport hunting really just adds to the problem. national eradication really isn't feasible, whether it's in the U.S. or from the Canadian level. And so there's no real national strategy. Only Alberta has a provincial plan in place. And the main focus really in Canada has been on meetings and planning with little focus on true management and efforts for actual removal. And this gets back to, the disease issue is that testing is a big open question. Really, there isn't a plan in place for testing or protocol, mostly out of fear of what potentially could be found and the implications that that could bring with it. And so, what's the distribution as it relates to Montana? Well, luckily, right now, there are no known feral swine populations in Montana. There have been some reports of feral swine sightings, but nothing has ever been confirmed. And when a sighting is reported, USDA Wildlife Services typically evokes a fairly widespread response for monitoring those areas, both from a camera and drone standpoint, and trying to confirm those detections. But where could they show up is what I like to focus on. People hear there's no feral swine, they kind of let their guard down. Naturally, if natural expansion occurs, it will come in from the northern reaches of Montana from Canada. But in reality, pigs can show up almost anywhere at any time. And, sometimes people give me a funny look when I say that is, who in Montana should be concerned? Everybody in Montana should be concerned. And that's because pigs are most likely to travel at about 65 to 70 miles an hour. And that's through the back of a pickup truck. That's through illegal, purposeful releases. And that's simply because they're the second most popular game animal in North America. A lot of people in the U.S. grow up hunting pigs. They like hunting pigs. They like, the feeling of that natural meat source. And so the best way to do that, if they want to hunt pigs in a different location, is to move pigs there themselves, not realizing, the impact that it could truly have. And so that's why I tell people in Montana, there's a lot of people in Montana that like to hunt. There's a lot of new people moving to Montana. And in light of COVID, that's kind of expedited itself. So when you have, people that enjoy hunting moving from other places, it also will increase the likelihood that someone unknowingly of what they're actually doing may try and move pigs into Montana. And that's kind of why Montana has taken the stance that, hunting wild pigs in the state of Montana is illegal and will continue to be illegal. And so that's why I kind of bring up this point of why no hunting is that, they're a popular game animal. It's the most likely reason for pigs moving from place to place is people wanting to hunt pigs in new places. And so that leads into why hunting is part of the problem. It's kind of like a friend of mine that works in extension in Texas said, find where you are on the map as it relates to Texas, who's been dealing with pig problems for decades now. And whatever we were doing then, don't do it now. As a lot of them would tell you, that hunting kind of made life more difficult. And that's because due to their reproductive efficiency and movement, swine can't be eradicated simply by hunting practices. And it goes back kind of to that biology, which is they exist in these sounders. And so when you hunt pigs, it modifies behavior and movements. It sends them nocturnal. It makes daytime aerial detection and monitoring of pigs very difficult. It starts to conflict with trapping efforts. You start hunting pigs and you disperse them away from where trapping efforts were ongoing. But most importantly, when you fail to eliminate the entire group, that entire sounder, it results in further dispersal of the animals. And that's because you've now educated those animals. And when you shoot or otherwise harass pigs, you break them up, you scatter them. And these females will then, if they disperse far enough, establish new sounders and start reproducing. And it basically increases dispersal as well as the reproductive rates of the pigs. And generally, it's very difficult through hunting to eliminate an entire sounder, especially through recreational hunting. And so there's a difference between culling, which are these real high intensive professional kind of operations designed to, when they go in, kill an entire sounder, versus recreational hunting, where one or two individuals is typically harvested. And so once they've experienced hunting pressure, they then become extremely difficult to hunt and are harder to eradicate. And that's basically because education is not the objective, but typically the result of hunting. And so management efforts really need to focus on whole sounder removal, and that's primarily through trapping. Known trapping, you get camera images, known sizes of the sounder, and you can get kind of real-time notification of when they're in the trap. And so you can remove the entire group. And once, why we say that eradication really isn't an answer anymore in some of these places is it's estimated just to maintain control of a population, you need to remove 70% of the local population annually. And some numbers are now reaching 80% is the thought of that. And so imagine in Texas where you have a couple million pigs, removing 2 to 3 million pigs on an annual basis just to maintain control is really, in some of those cases, impossible. But in most places, getting 70 to 80% local population control is incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. And if hunting is further, extirpating the problem and causing dispersal, then that makes it even more difficult. And not only in like, well, then the simple answer is let's just make it, across the board illegal to hunt. But unfortunately, there's some challenges to that, and some that you're probably not going to get rid of. Across much of the Southeast and a lot of the portion of the United States where pigs are, they've been there for decades, if not since, colonization. And so you have this tremendous growth in popularity of hunting pigs. You can see it in marketing and social media and advertisements, and just the simple belief that, going out and killing a pig is helping. And then you have this growing private industry and these financial incentives. And that may be the most hardest to overcome, is that you got people who for decades have relied on, from an income standpoint, of providing pig removal sources or products, or, from a recreational aspect of, the money it brings in from a state agency standpoint, or, maybe the portfolio diversification for a landowner is being able to charge out leases or paid for hunts. And then you've got the food production aspect as well. And then lastly, you've got, universities named after razorbacks and pigs and these growing cultures, and, the, wild hog queen, and these, festivals and community identity, and that, feral swine and feral swine hunting and wild pigs have just been a part of these communities for as long as they've existed. And so it's deeply ingrained, and, that's very difficult to suddenly say, you can't do that anymore. And so there's some real challenges to the states that already allow hunting for that to be removed. However, in Montana, where that isn't established, and they've kind of taken that approach, we're ahead of the game in that regard. And so that kind of brings us into, Montana's regulations and their management responses from a state perspective. And, number one is it's been great to see this unified approach from all the various agencies in full support of eliminating any kind of incentive for the import of wild pigs from a recreational standpoint. And that's why feral swine in Montana is illegal. And so when you see a pig, don't shoot it. That's why. It's more important to get the wildlife services in there detecting it and trapping that entire group, rather dispersing it and making potentially one group 5 or 6 reproducing groups. And so, as well as educating and turning them nocturnal. Montana law, if you actually sight or see a wild pig or a feral swine, by law, you have about 24 hours to report it to the Montana Department of Livestock. And really the number is there on the Squeal on Pigs. That's kind of the hotline. If anyone in Montana sees a feral swine, please tell them to call that number. That is going to be our best defense at maintaining kind of a wild pig free state. Whenever feral swine become a problem, they threaten livestock, agriculture, property, forest, and all sorts of natural areas, native wildlife, and just biodiversity in general. And it also stands as a public health and safety issue from a human stance. So please report any feral swine sighting, signs, damage to wildlife, personnel. That number is the best place to call. That will distribute that information to the necessary officials. And it's especially important if you're in an area where feral swine is potentially at risk. So the northern areas along the Canadian border particularly need to be vigilant. But I tell anyone in the state of Montana at any point in time, you could see pigs show up simply from someone bringing them in with kind of the misguided thought of being able to hunt pigs. And so the response from Montana has been really great, and it's been kind of twofold. One has been on education and outreach, and that has been dispersing a clear and consistent message, and that's across agencies, which is really great to see. And then gaining the public support and disseminating information and then increasing just the awareness. And then the focus will be on developing best management practices. And really, most of it comes down to increasing the public realization of the effects that wild pigs have. It's not just a rural concern. It's not just a livestock concern. It's a human health concern. It's an urban environment concern. It's a concern to both private and public lands. It's just a very clear stance is that if you have pigs, they're going to impact any demographic within the state. And so the other kind of prong to the education and outreach is early detection and monitoring. And that's why Montana has established this Squeal on Pigs campaign, which was created in partnership with the Montana Invasive Species Council and the Montana Department of Livestock. They have a website, they have some fact sheets, and really it's that kind of hotline they've established to call is that early detection and monitoring is key to eradicating and keeping Montana a wild pig free state, because it's like I said, it's basically a ticking time bomb until you go into control mode instead of eradication. And from that, there's a lot of really good resources. The Montana Department of Livestock and the Montana Invasive Species Council are kind of in control of the management of feral swine or wild pigs if they come into Montana, and the education outreach, as well as USDA Wildlife Services and the trapping and removal efforts. And from an education and outreach standpoint, Montana State University, your county agents, obviously keep them involved. If you have concerns, they can provide you the necessary information, or reach out to me where we'll work in collaboration to make sure we get you the information that you need. I always highlight USDA APHIS feral swine. They're the national, source for feral swine management, removal, and control, and they have a large selection of resources as well. Their resources I utilize as well, and so their website's up there, and then kind of a list of some of their ID guides, some of the research going on, as well as their brochures and fact sheets. And from that, you're also welcome to reach out to me at any time. I will do my best to find the information that you need. And those two links there will take you to the Wildlife Extension Programming page as well as our webpage with MSU. And so with that, I'll just kind of wrap things up and hand it back over to you.
All right.
If you have questions.
Yeah, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat box. While we wait, though, I've got one. Is there any, do you know if there will be any effect either from the bears on the wild pigs or vice versa?
So predation would certainly occur from the bears. And the problem can be twofold. It's due to their the pig's ability to reproduce. It will come close to impacting control numbers. So you still have a pig problem, but now you have a resource across the landscape to sustain bears and increase bear movement and distribution and population. And so it wouldn't be from a bear stance of controlling the pigs. It would be more of the pig as an added resource for growing our bear populations, which we can save that conversation for another topic.
Cool. All right, we'll wait a couple minutes, see if we get any questions come in. I'm just going to paste a link to a survey in the chat. If you guys could do that, all of us in Extension, we need evaluations all the time. It's our life now. So if you could go ahead and fill that out. Give me an idea of how the webinar was and how Jared did. But I'm not seeing any questions coming in. If you can't find the chat box, Q&A will also work. I'm not seeing any in there either. So with that, thank you, Jared. It was awesome. I learned a lot. And for those of you attending, we've got one more next week on residential insect control. So make sure you get registered for that on our website. And see you next week or whenever.
Great. Thank you again.